Hi, this is Bracken Brown, biologist-naturalist with Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, and I head up our Farmland Raptor project. And we are really excited to be a part of the Pennsylvania Sustainable Agriculture Conference once again this year, and really looking forward to reaching out to you, the agrarian community. Our target with this project is to maintain habitat and report sightings of 4 of our grassland key raptor species: the northern harrier, short-eared owl, American kestrel, and barn owl. To do this, we rely on the community. And with over 7 million acres of Pennsylvania designated as agricultural purposes, with 4 million of that designated as croplands, and 706,000 acres of that specifically for pasture uses, we have a lot of people in the agricultural community that play a key critical role in maintaining these species within the state of Pennsylvania. We wanted to take some time today to focus on pastured livestock because that tends to mimic a nice grassland community better than most of the croplands we associate with farming purposes. And with a 14% reduction in designated pasture lands between 2015 and 2017, we definitely want to pay attention to this change in ag use because that can have drastic impacts on these raptor species that require grassland habitat. However, most cropland at some point throughout the year can host these raptor species. So while something like corn is a tall row crop monoculture, which shuts out these foraging raptors for most of the summer season, in the fall when there's stalks in the field, this can provide excellent roosting habitat for things like short-eared owls and northern harrier that spend most of their time out associated with the ground. But we really want to focus on pastures and regions that allow for some natural buffer zones along the edges of fields or farm lanes where grassland herbaceous plants can grow up and allow these raptors to continue to use the habitat to forage in. So I introduced our 4 main target raptors for this is the northern harrier, which is a very slim, acrobatic, low-flying raptor with a very prominent white rump at the base of the tail. These birds can be seen foraging at low altitude right above your ag fields, and will typically show you that rump pretty quick. Another one that uses open grassland is the short-eared owl. It's a mid-sized owl species that has a lot of brown striping with a pale buffy face and those bright yellow eyes that are very distinctive. These guys like to begin foraging before the end of the day, and they hold their wings slightly stiffly, but similar to the northern harrier, they're going to be a low-level flyer that sort of gives a moth-like impression as it's out foraging across the open grassland. These species are considered endangered and threatened within the state of Pennsylvania because they actually put their nests on the ground, so they need much larger areas that aren't going to get mown during the nesting season to successfully breed and reproduce. In 2018, we only had 1 account of short-eared owls within the state, but that was in a reclaimed mine setting, so again, it was a larger open grassland setting that this bird could use. We are fortunate that our smallest falcon here, the American kestrel, which is a sexually dimorphic species with the male having a blue-gray color across the wings and on top of the head, which is counterposed with nice bright russet red on the back and the tail, while the females are sort of a reddish brown across with heavy black barring. These are cavity nesters. So while they are small, only about the size of a blue jay, they do really well in smaller grassland plots associated with pasture land especially. And as a cavity nester, you can put up a bird box for them, which we'll tell you more about. Our final species is the barn owl. These are very distinctive, found around the world, but they have the pure white underneath with a tawny buff, lightly patterned back. So they're a very distinctive species that relies heavily on using old farm buildings to nest in. So one of the main factors that seems to be impacting these 4 species within the state of Pennsylvania is changes to land management, particularly agriculture. We're seeing a shift away from pastured livestock like we have behind me, and that will change the land use from managing a grassland meadow setting, which is preferred habitat for these species, to either a row crop setting or even being lost to land development. So this is a huge factor that's going to be impacting these species moving forward, because without the necessary foraging habitat available to them, you can't sustain these useful populations that will help out maintaining farmland pests like rodents and insects. You can see behind us here in the distance, we have 2 examples of managed pasture. In the foreground here, it was mown in the late summer season, while across in the back, where you can see a lot of vegetation sticking through the snow still, it hasn't been mown yet this season. This is an important factor that can have dramatic influence on whether these raptor species can sustain themselves throughout the winter months. With the late season mowing, all of the rodents that might be out in that habitat are going to be deeper under the snow, harder for a raptor to find and get to. Whereas the unmown section, you have vegetation stalks sticking up above the snow, which not only provides protection for any raptor that's looking to hang out or roost on the ground in that area, but it also tends to draw rodents up to the surface as they try to get the seed pods that are held on the plant heads above the snow surface. So it allows the raptors to utilize the landscape a lot more effectively, and provides habitat for a lot of other species. So not only are you encouraging rodents up to expose themselves, but those grass seed heads and other seeds from herbaceous plants are going to be available to grassland specializing bird species like a lot of your wintering sparrows. We still find that while there's an increase in organic farming effort, which is fantastic for these raptor species through the dramatic reduced use of chemicals associated with growing those vegetables, they tend to be smaller scale operations. So that's more suited to recruiting a kestrel pair into your property, but it really depends on what the surrounding landscape around that smaller scale organic effort looks like. But we're still seeing that the primary #1 agricultural practice that really benefits these species is getting pastured livestock out into the landscape, and that really recruits them in, because as your livestock are moving through and grazing, they'll disturb insects, rodents, and that's what the raptors are going to be targeting on. So get raptors involved, and together we'll get a partnership going. You can reach out to our project, but in the meantime, I'm going to show you some ways to place 2 types of boxes for our 2 cavity nesting species, the barn owl and the American kestrel, and hopefully they'll be your next most valuable employee on your farm. 2 of our species that are doing a little better in the state, the American kestrel and the barn owl, have the benefit of being cavity nesters, which is nice because that means we can actually supplement them and put up nest boxes to promote breeding success within the agricultural setting. So this is your typical American kestrel box, as well as the barn owl box. And these you can place anywhere on your property that's facing an open field and have the possibility of recruiting one of these species to them. We will say that unused barn owl box has been used by kestrels, so cavity space is often a limiting resource in the ecosystem. So you'll have a lot of competition when you put up available cavities for species. So something like American kestrels, they can be in direct competition with European starlings. If you're putting the boxes up around on barn sheds and barns, you're more likely to recruit starlings, which most people don't want. So we are going to take some advantage later and show you some of our more successful sites and talk about where to place these boxes on your own property to hopefully recruit one of these species into your environment. Similar with the barn owl, you're going to want to place the box where the birds are using it. So if you happen to notice that you have an owl already roosting on your property, try to put up a box near it in the hopes of recruiting them to nest there. We'll see barn owls often are seen both in the wintering period as well as the breeding period in the exact same stretch of fields. So while they need a little more extensive open land than American kestrels, they will use the same spot both inside and outside of the nesting season. Whereas American kestrels are great all around. They only need about 5 acres of semi-open habitat to set up a territory and breed successfully. So they are a nice one to recruit, especially if you're doing a smaller scale farming project and you have, you know, open land that connects with neighbors. You can have a kestrel using that mosaic system, no problem, without running into the issues of having something like a Cooper's hawk in the woods backing up the field, coming out and taking out the kestrel. So we're going to go through and establish some perks of recruiting these two species, the barn owl and the American kestrel, through the use of box placement on your own property. Attached to this video program, there should be some PDF pamphlets of how to make and construct your own box. So you can either get these boxes through a program from the Pennsylvania Game Commission or even the Farmland Raptor project. If you live close enough to us, we can get you a box for free. So there's a bunch of avenues and you'll get a nice information pamphlet on how to build and place your own box. So for the American kestrel box, it's the same basic structure as your typical birdhouse or bluebird house that a lot of people like to put out. A couple characteristics is you want some gaps in the box to allow for venting, to let air currents flow through the box so you're not turning it into a pressure cooker. So there's vents at the top that allows airflow throughout the season so it doesn't turn into a extremely dirty place, because being a cavity nester, the young chicks are going to be pooping inside the box. So that's something to take into consideration, and you'll note in the plans that's all laid out for you. But the main thing is get the box out where it's facing away from the direction that the elements are coming in. So typically you want a southerly facing box that's facing out into the open environment that the birds are likely to use while hunting. If you are lucky enough to get a box used, you'll get to enjoy the frequent prey deliveries throughout the season. And a lot of people find enjoyment of determining what their birds are actually bringing back to the young to feed them through the different stages. Barn owl box, it's a bigger box for a bigger bird, but it's a similar characteristic for all of the forms of the box. You always want an access door of some sort so you can clean it occasionally. These boxes have drilled holes through the bottom of them to allow that airflow again. These birds don't build downy nests. They typically just do a scrape to lay their eggs into, so rough wood chips are exactly what they need. And then you have a larger door. These boxes can be placed inside barns, unused silos, or out on poles in an open meadow setting to recruit the birds into your area. And with barn owl boxes, the birds will use the box throughout the year for roosting. So they're not just using it for the nesting period where they're laying eggs and rearing young, but longer design so the bird can get away from the open door. They feel safe and secure. And then you still have all of the access points to get in, maintain, and clean it. And if you're lucky enough to be hooked up with a banding program, partway through the nestling rearing phase, you can have a certified bander come out. They'll go up and actually band the chicks. So they are individually marked to your property. And if they're ever encountered again, it's an easy data search to find out where your birds are dispersing to. So there's a lot of great resources that allow you to continue to engage with the species on your property. And building boxes is a great workshop program for those farm kids that are stuck at home trying to do virtual learning in school. We have a couple great programs that can incorporate with both science and woodworking to get some extra credit, hopefully. So the first site I want to share with you guys is a standalone pole out in an open field setting for kestrels. This also applies to barn owls. For box placement, both species like it when they're 10 feet or above, but you don't want these boxes so high that you can't easily access them for maintenance throughout the year. With this box, it's actually placed in what used to be an old dairy pasture. There haven't been cows on this property for over 10 years now, so the pasture has turned into sort of a reclaimed grassland setting here. But this tends to be one of our more successful boxes, and as I said, being on a standalone pole out in the open often reduces the number of times a starling is going to try to use the box. So you tend to have a higher or cleaner success rate with kestrels being recruited in. This site is great both for wintering and breeding birds using it. So often we'll have kestrels nest here and they can put out up to 5 young, no problem, with all of this great habitat in the immediate vicinity. Now, I did say it was an open pasture land. The box is facing slightly south. So you can see that now that it's not being actively grazed, we've had recruitment by a lot of cold season grasses, and you have the taller herbaceous plants moving in, goldenrod seed heads, teasel, that sort of thing. And this pasture bridged both sides of a small creek going through, so you have that nice mosaic of wetland and slightly drier grassland areas. This is great for vole habitat. And because this isn't getting actively mowed, we have great hiding spots for any of those ground roosting birds. Barn owls will go out here, but also short-eared owls and northern harriers have been seen using this field fairly regularly. So they have this taller vegetation to hide in. So if you always have the chance and you're looking to maybe mow your pasture in the end of the winter season, going into winter, it's great if you can leave some of these swaths of unmown areas that provide the taller vegetation for those species to come in and use as a day or nighttime roost for safety. But this area, we have both American kestrel and barn owl boxes in the general region, and both species will use the same habitat for hunting, like I said, just night shift, day shift. There have been reports of barn owls and kestrels trying to use the same box. Typically that ends up very poorly for the American kestrel. So if you can provide cavities that are targeting both species in the same area, you oftentimes can have both of them cohabitating in the same general region. So I mentioned earlier, and I just want to reiterate the importance of seasonality and mowing with these species. So oftentimes to a bird, a hay field operates roughly similarly to a grassland setting. So they may show up and use a hay field to nest, which isn't great when you're trying to make your cuttings. But if the species are using pasture lands, it's great when you can leave sections that aren't just a thin strip of unmown grass, but a larger chunk, because that makes it easier for the birds to hide in, especially if you're lucky enough to get a northern harrier or a short-eared owl nesting on your property. If you see the nest and just mow around it, leave a small triangle, oftentimes that can turn into sort of an attractant for predators to come in and check out that area, resulting in the nest getting predated. But if you have a big square chunk of unmown pasture land, that can help hide these species. And same goes for the winter time. These birds are looking for an area where they can hunt as well as hide from predators while they're roosting. So if you can't afford to leave larger sections unmown, especially with this mix in height of shorter grasses up to taller grasses and herby plants, you will be benefiting not only that raptor that is looking for a safe place to tuck in while it's resting as well as hunt, but you're also benefiting a lot of other open grassland species, bluebirds, meadow voles, which are going to feed the raptors. So you're benefiting a lot of wildlife through a simple step of just choosing not to mow in the late fall winter season. So you're providing habitat and protection for those species throughout the entirety of the winter. So another box placement type is just on the side of either your barn or one of your outbuilding sheds. Kestrels are more than happy to use these spaces, especially if they open up out into that preferred open habitat, either pasture or cropland. Behind the camera here, we have soybean field that runs straight out to that unused pasture for the open pasture placement on the pole box. So it opens up directly into the kestrel's preferred feeding habitat. In addition to allowing you often to see more of the kestrel as you're moving around your place of operation, one of the slight downsides of putting boxes up on sheds like this is oftentimes European starlings readily will attempt to use kestrel boxes. So you'll have a little bit of direct competition if you don't immediately have kestrels around in the early breeding season when they're looking to select a nest site. So you run the risk of potentially having to remove starlings periodically throughout the nesting season. But kestrels are more than happy to use these sites, and oftentimes I've seen boxes that are, only 7 feet off the ground that kestrels are still using, as long as they face out into the appropriate habitat. These birds are pretty forgiving on what sort of spaces they'll use. Especially with old wood barns, you might have kestrels move in to a space up near the roof as holes become available. So putting a box on the side of a shed like this is going to recruit kestrels no problem. If you have trees along the edge of your ag field, you can just put a box straight up in a tree. This is going to change. So whereas on the shed placement, you tended to have higher competition with things like European starlings. The main competition when you put it up in a tree can be squirrels and other rodents setting up nests in it and excluding kestrels. But these trees along the edge of fields make great box placements because they're out in the open. Kestrels are using them to forage. So if you have a tree on the property line or anything that's out in the open, putting a box on them is an excellent substrate to use that's readily available. So for barn owl box placement, again, you want to put the boxes in places that the owls are already likely to use. So most boxes get placed either on the side of or even inside of barns, whether they're being used or not for agricultural purposes. Oftentimes the owls will still continue to use them. On this farm, again, we're highlighting this, what used to be an old dairy operation. So the silos behind me are no longer in operation. They're sort of falling apart inside. But a box has been placed in this white silo right at the top of the access ladder running up the side. And this is a site where the owls will perch throughout the winter. So they were observed using the silo for roost habitat several years before the box actually went into place. And now that the box is put up where they're wanting to be, the hope is that the owls will just switch from roosting at the site to nesting in the site. It's backed up by a lot of open agricultural fields and that mixed old pasture land that's overgrown now. So there's a lot of great hunting habitat for these owls to be using and foraging in. Barn owl boxes come in a variety of designs. You don't just have to use the rectangular one that we highlighted here in the video, but ideally you're looking for a larger box where the birds can lay the eggs or roost far enough from the opening that they feel protected and secure when they're in there. So some people just put it on a beam inside the barn, and the owls will use that just fine. So when considering a site to place your barn owl box, using a post mount like with the kestrel boxes out in the open field is great. So when looking for a site to place the barn owl box, they can also use that open field mounted on a post type box. They tend to not like mounted on a tree as much. But you can always offer them a box out in the open that they can use. This has met with a lot of success in orchards and vineyard type settings, where people are recruiting a predatory species into the area to hopefully keep down on the fruit eating birds using the site as much. I will say that barn owls definitely prefer wooden structures over the sheet metal barns. Because that creates a lot of natural cavities, crevices that they can get into and access reliably versus trying to squeeze through metal. So there is some preference in the building structures that these guys will use, but as long as you're placing the box at a spot that the owl can access and it's going to feel secure, because you don't want to put it in the main hay mow of your barn that you're accessing to feed livestock out of every day. That's going to bump a female that's trying to incubate eggs, interrupt the incubation cycle. So if you have a quieter corner of the barn, feel free to put a box up there, or with access to the outside. Some people will cut the access hole just through the side of the barn. So the box isn't on the exterior of the barn, but the owls can access it from the outside. That works well. Or go with a more open, freestanding site out in the field where you want these birds to be hanging out to benefit your operation is a great way to find where to place these boxes. So for this program, you might be asking the question, why should we be making changes or actively pursuing different land management techniques to promote these specific species? These 4 species represent apex predators in a very specific ecosystem community type, and that is the open grassland meadows. And all 4 of these species have been showing steady declines throughout the state, some more so than others. The short-eared owl and northern harrier, with the fact that they're always on the ground, both for nesting and roosting purposes, presents a higher exposure rate to predation events. So we've seen steeper declines in them, especially during the breeding season, but even barn owls and American kestrels are in relative decline. Now, there are many factors at play in why these species are declining, but one of the main ones is land management changes. So agriculture is often getting turned into development. We're losing many acres a year. And once a land is developed, that is not ideal for any of these species, so that's going to exclude them from the property line. And another big factor is changes in agricultural practices. So equipment is getting more efficient, seasonality is changing with when hay is getting cut. That is often putting them in conflict with these species attempting to nest. So there's some changes in how we're going about agriculture. As well as a big one is chemical exposure rates. Neonicotinoids, which are often used for insecticides and that sort of thing, have been shown to have a marked debilitating factor for a lot of raptor species. So something like a kestrel that's eating a lot of exposed insects, most of them can, especially shortly after spraying has occurred, that kestrel is going to become a repository for a higher contamination load for that insecticide. Same is true for rodenticides. Often these are set up around buildings to reduce rat population and that sort of thing from taking over your grain storage areas or your livestock facilities. And any rat that is succumbing to poison is often going to be a higher risk value to getting predated by an owl or some other raptor. That raptor is going to come eat that contaminated rodent or take it back to the nest and feed it to its nestlings. One example of a rodenticide that has been shown to have a lethal, or at least assist with lethal impact to a lot of scavenging raptor species, is Brodifacoum, which is readily available and easily bought. But the main downfall of this is it has a fairly long active period. So it takes several days for it to stop being an active poisoning agent. So as it's used to kill off rodents, those rodents, as they're dying, become very active targets or attractive targets to a foraging raptor species. And that raptor will come down and eat the contaminated rodent. And then suddenly, after it's eaten 3 or 4 of these contaminated rodents, it has a high carrying capacity of Brodifacoum, which could have lethal or other impairing factors to its system. So as we move forward, it is great to think about what the secondary exposure events, if you do have to use some sort of chemical, how long is that going to be an active agent within the ecosystem around you, and what is going to be the resulting impact of use of that chemical within the system. And a great example is health of our raptor species. As a relative apex predator, they are going to give you the indication of the health of the ecosystem. And as we continue to research, especially kestrels, we're starting a long-term study that's looking at causes for the decline. We are actively taking blood samples, and those tissue samples will show us exposure rates and whether these birds are carrying high or low loads of these active chemicals, and we're going to try to tease out what impacts that could have. But for something like Brodifacoum, it has been showing up, especially out west, where dealing with pocket gophers is a popular application for it. And there have been many eagles and other raptors submitted to rehabbers that have subsequently died with relatively high levels of this toxin in their system. So, whole reason is, why is this important? We want to maintain these charismatic species that are using our landscape, both in the wintering and breeding ground, and make sure that they are set up to continue to forage and hunt rodents within our agrarian pastoral landscape. So regardless of the size of your agricultural operation, whether it's a couple acres for vegetables up to several hundred acres devoted to crops and or livestock, you can become a host for one of these 4 iconic grassland species that are on a decline within the state of Pennsylvania. We strongly encourage you to recruit these species to your habitat, because not only will you be benefiting them in their time of conservation awareness and need, but they will benefit you in aiding you with reduction of your pest species, whether that be rodents or insects. Timing of these species nesting cycles fall in line with production booms in either the insects hatching cycles, grasshoppers especially time in well with the American kestrel's fledging period. So there's a lot of young birds learning to hunt on those grasshoppers that are trying to eat your hay or other crops. So there's a net benefit to having these species on your area of operation. And even if you have a small operation, putting up that American kestrel box can still be met with success as you recruit a bird that might not only use your property, but the neighbor's property as well during the breeding cycles. The goal of the Farmland Raptor project is to spread information and awareness of these species so that the general public and the landowners can adopt them and make simple changes throughout their daily routines to benefit both them and the species. We definitely would really appreciate you guys reaching out with any sightings you might have. So if you have birds actively nesting and using your property already, we would love to hear about that so that we can then in turn make better informed decisions for managing these species long term so that they're here within the state of Pennsylvania. Again, these are charismatic species that you will enjoy to watch, and we're hoping to make sure that there's protection and allowances so that they continue to flourish and stay in the state of Pennsylvania. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing from you. Feel free to reach out with any questions you might have about where to place the boxes within the landscape of your hometown and environment, and consider starting your own nest box ring between you and your neighbors, and see how many birds you can actually recruit into your area. The Pennsylvania Game Commission has a very active barn owl nest box monitoring program going on. And if you're close enough to our own American Kestrel nest box monitoring program, we would always love to hear about a new spot to put a box for these species. Otherwise, feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions whatsoever concerning grassland raptors in the state of Pennsylvania and how agricultural lands can benefit them. Thank you for listening, and enjoy the rest of the virtual conference. I'd like to thank not only Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, which is the housing agency for the Farmland Raptors project, but the myriad of supports through volunteer efforts and collaboration efforts with the Pennsylvania Game Commission for the barn owls, as well as donor organizations.